My name is Bernardine Evaristo. I'd like to introduce you to my 8th book, which is a novel called Girl, Woman, Other. It's a novel that I wrote because I wanted to write about lots of different black women's stories. So in a sense, it's a celebration of black womanhood, black British womanhood, to be specific. There are 12 protagonists and they each have their own sections and their lives in some way overlap. And I wanted to explore a variety of women. So they're aged 19 to 93. They have different cultural backgrounds. So for example, some have African cultural backgrounds, some have Caribbean cultural backgrounds. They have different occupations. They are also different sexualities. I have a non-binary character as well. And I wanted to look at their lives from childhood through to the present time and to look at their ambitions, their dreams, their relationships, their families. Well, I suppose that's another important thing to say, is that there are 4 mother and daughter partnerships in the book as well, and to give voice to the kinds of characters I'd like to see in fiction that I really don't see, and that's the thinking behind the book. And it has a slightly innovative form in that I call it a fusion fiction, but don't let that put you off. It's actually a novel. It's very easy to read. But the stories kind of fuse together, and there's also sort of a fusion in terms of form as well, which you'd have to read to find out what I mean. So I'm here in Waterstones in Piccadilly, and I'd like to introduce you to 3 books that I read when I was in my 20s, which were really important and really helped shape my thinking as a writer and gave me the confidence to become a writer. The first book I'd like to introduce you to is Sister Outsider by Audre Lorde, who is enjoying a renaissance at the moment, which is incredible because I was introduced to her work when I was in my 20s in the 80s, and I met her a few times as well when she came to London, which was incredible. The reason I love this book, and actually love her entire oeuvre, is because she was a very powerful black feminist at a time when we really didn't have a voice out there in the world. She was also a lesbian, and she kind of stood by her lesbianism and was very out and took all the punches because of that. She was what we might call one of the first intersectional feminists, in that she drew together issues around class and gender and race and sexuality, and looked at all those things in terms of her being a feminist voice. This book is full of essays, including a trip to Russia she took in the 70s. She was also, for many years, a cancer survivor. She also talks about the power of speaking out and breaking through the silence. And she really is speaking to black women first. But what I find really interesting now is that she's got a global audience that is beyond the barriers of colour, and a lot of women, white women, are really enjoying her work. So the most important thing about Audre Lorde for me was that she was a woman writing essays about being a black woman, which spoke to me at a time when I needed to hear those words and her wisdom, because there was such little work being published anywhere in the world from that perspective, a black feminist perspective. So that's why I'd like to champion Sister Outsider by Audre Lorde. So the second book that was a really important formative influence on me as a young writer was Ntozake Shange's For Colour Girls Who Have Considered Suicide When the Rainbow Is Enough, which is called a choreo poem, but it's also called a kind of prose poem. Ntozake Shange was, again, an African-American writer, and this was originally a performance. It was a production that it was shown in off-Broadway, and then it came to London in around 1981 when I was a drama student, which was my initial career was as an actor, and I went to see it, and it was absolutely mind-blowing for me because it was about 7 African-American women telling their stories, and it was, I cannot tell you how unusual that was. It was rare. It was the first time, I would say, that had happened in a British production house, British theatre. So this book is about 7 black women, and she tells their stories through this kind of fusion prose poetry form, and she captures the essence of their lives. As you can see, it's not a thick book. This is actually the original that I bought, I think, in 1981. As you can see, it's old, and it's a beautiful little copy, and I'll never get rid of it. So these women, as I said, she captures the snapshots of their lives and talks about their difficulties and their celebrations, and really brings them to life. And when it was performed, it was done through dance. And the women are only identified according to a colour. So there's lady in yellow and lady in red, and so on and so forth. This is a text that has been performed all around the world ever since, and it was made into a Hollywood film about 6 years ago. I think a lot of people connect to it because it's so beautifully written. It's quite experimental in form, but also that she's capturing these voices at a time when we didn't hear these voices. So the next book I'd like to share with you is Selected Poems by Derek Walcott. And here it is. Derek Walcott has been my favourite poet since my sort of late 20s. I was first introduced to his collection Midsummer, which was a collection of sonnets, and I absolutely fell in love with his writing. He died a few years ago. Some of you might know that he won the Nobel Prize for Literature in the 90s, which was an amazing honour. He's from the Caribbean, from St. Lucia, and he lived most of his life in St. Lucia. You know, most Caribbean writers, they leave and go and live somewhere else, but he stayed there, and he wrote from that perspective. What I love about his work is that, first of all, the absolute beauty of his language. He makes the ordinary extraordinary through the most incredible images, I think unrivaled in my opinion. So I love that about his work, but also he writes about memory and history, empire, slavery, loss, family, aging, all kinds of issues, and he just kind of meshes them together, sometimes in a single poem, so that he takes you on this journey, this emotional journey, intellectual journey, historical journey, existential journey through his work, in particular through Midsummer, which, as I said, was my introduction to him. And there's an emotional depth, there's an intellectual gravitas, there's also a playfulness, and there's an originality to his work that for me is unrivaled. It's always very personal, but his work speaks to me as a poet in ways that other poets don't. So if you haven't been introduced to Derek Walcott, check him out and see what you're going to be in for. It'll be a delight, hopefully.